All righty. And okay, ladies and gentlemen, Marcia, take it away.
Thank you, Nancy. Good morning, everybody. We'll open our surprise after the presentation, continuing to hold you in suspense. However, it is my pleasure today to introduce, I don't know why I have Priscilla on my screen. I should be seeing myself, but I will just continue. It's my pleasure to introduce to you this morning Reverend David Frainer, who is a retired Unitarian Universalist minister. With his wife, acupuncturist Lisa Rothermick, he co-founded Gentle Currents Wellness Center located in Greenland. Reverend Frainer served as co-chair of the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program several years ago. The PPLP, as its acronym goes, sponsors a poet laureate for a 2-year term. During that time, the poet laureate initiates a program to build community through poetry. During his tenure, he worked with 4 poets laureate. Recently, Reverend Frainer, along with 3 colleagues, founded the storytelling nonprofit True Tales Live. True Tales Live offers lively monthly storytelling programs, formerly at Portsmouth Public TV Studio and now on Zoom. In addition to production assistance, Reverend Frainer edits the program's e-newsletter, True Tales Times. This morning's program, in a way, combines these 2 interests. The 2 holiday stories he will be telling, A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas, and Every Man Heart Lay Down by Lorenz Graham, are actually prose poems. They are narratives written with a poet's feel for rhythm and cadence. David will introduce each of the stories with background about how he got involved with the stories, or more accurately, how they got involved with him. David notes that while these are being Zoomed, they can be enjoyed by closing your eyes and just listening to the stories as they unfold, as if they were on old time radio. Please welcome Reverend David Frainer.
Thank you very much, Marcia. It's my pleasure to join you. Thank you, Marcia and Nancy, both of you. This should be quite an adventure. So I want to, each of the stories needs a bit of introduction and a little bit of background. Excuse me. The first story I'm going to tell is A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. The story is about 25 minutes or a half hour long. And the second story is entitled Every Man's Heart Lay Down, as Marcia mentioned. And to begin, I first heard A Child's Christmas in Wales when I was living at home with my parents when I was 9 years old. And they got their first ever high fidelity stereo system. Well, it was pre-stereo actually. And they brought home from New York City, we lived on Long Island, they brought home this record album with this weird guy telling this story about a child's Christmas. And they put it on the record and they played it. And I just hated it. I wanted Frosty the Snowman and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Christmas carols. But instead they put this weird thing on, a brand new high fidelity system. And I didn't understand a bit of it. And every year, when I was 10, when I was 11, year after year, every year at Christmas time, they'd put on this record and I'd have to sit there and listen to it. Well, a funny thing happened. As I got older, as I got into high school and college and eventually into graduate school, I would listen when I was at home on Christmas holiday break. And I began to understand more and more about the story and finally really came to love the story. Some more recently, some years ago, I was the interim minister at Hudson, in our church in Hudson and Marlborough in Massachusetts. It's about an hour and a quarter drive from where I lived on the seacoast. And I decided during that time that I would use a cassette tape. You know, there were these things called cassette tapes and cars had them. So I listened to a cassette tape of A Child's Christmas in Wales on the way down and on the way back during my commute, during my 2-year interim. And by the end of that time, I completely fallen in love with the story and pretty much learned the whole thing. So that's how I got involved with A Child's Christmas in Wales. I think it's one of the sort of great undersold or underknown stories of the holiday season. Now I need to say a little bit about how I'm going to proceed with the story. As I said, it's a 25-minute, 30-minute story, something like that. And I'm going to say it, tell it in 5 sections with 5 different chapters, you might say. The story isn't written that way. That's not the way Dylan Thomas did it. But it's a kind of a complex story. It goes from narrative to description to flights of fancy and back again. And it helps to have kind of a breathing space between each of the sections or each of the chapters. So that's what I've done. I'll pause after each section and then we'll go on from there. So I've even got these handy dandy homemade posters. And the first chapter is entitled Fire, A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the Seatown corner, now and out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases rolled down toward the two-tongued sea, like a cold and headlong moon bundling down the sky that was our street. And they stopped at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands in the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays, resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea, and out come Mrs. Prothero and the fireman. It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden with her son Jim, waiting for cats. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December in my memory is white as Lapland, although there were no reindeer, but there were cats, sleek and long as jaguars and horrible whiskered, spitting and snarling. They would slink and sidle down the white back garden wall. And the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasin trappers from Hudson Bay off Mumbles Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed Arctic marksmen from the muffling silence of the eternal snows. Eternal, ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden, or if we heard it all at all, it was to us as the far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, neighbor's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. Fire, cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the dinner gong, and we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms toward the house, and smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bombulating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats and whales standing on a wall in a row. We bounded into the house laden with snowballs and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face, but he was saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with his slipper. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong. "They won't be there," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them waving his slipper as though he were conducting. "Do something," he said, and we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero, and ran out of the house to the telephone box. Let's call the police as well, Jim said, and the ambulance, and Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires. But we all called the fire brigade, and soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. Nobody could have had a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turned off the hose and were standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen in their shining helmets standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, "Would you like anything to read?" Next chapter, Postman and Presents. Years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves in Wales and birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills, and we sang and wallowed all night and day in caves that smelt like Sunday afternoons in damp front farmhouse parlors, and we chased with the jawbones of deacons the English and the bears before the motor car, before the wheel, before the Duchess-faced horse, when we rode the daft and happy hills bareback. It snowed and it snowed. But here a small boy says, "It snowed last year too. I made a snowman and my brother knocked it down, and I knocked my brother down, and then we had tea." But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from whitewashed buckets down the sky, it came shoaling out of the ground and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure and grandfather moss, minutely white-ivied the walls, and settled on the postman opening the gate like a dum-dum thunderstorm of white, torn Christmas. Were there postmen then too? With sprinkling eyes and wind-cherried noses on spread frozen feet, they crunched up to the doors and mittened on them manfully. But all that the children could hear was a ringing of bells. "You mean that the postman went rat-a-tat-tat and the doors rang?" "I mean that the bells that the children could hear were inside. I only hear thunder sometimes, never bells." There were church bells too. Inside them? No, no, no. In the bat-black snow-white belfries tugged by bishops and storks, and they rang their glad tidings over the bandaged town, over the folded foam of the powder and ice cream hills, over the crackling sea. It seemed that all the church bells boomed for joy under our window, and the weathercocks crew for Christmas on our fence. Get back to the postman. They were just ordinary postmen, fond of walking and dogs and Christmas and snow. They stood on the white welcome mats in the little drifted porches and huffed and puffed, making ghosts with their breath, and jogged from foot to foot like small boys wanting to go out. And then the presents, and then the presents after the Christmas box, and the cold postman with a rose on his tingled down the tree tray slithered run of the chilly glinting hill. He went in his ice-bound boots like a man on fishmonger's slabs. He wagged his bag like a frozen camel's hump, then dizzily turned the corner on wood, and by God, he was gone. Get back to the presents. There were the useful presents. engulfing mufflers of the old coach days, and mittens made for giant sloths, zebra scarves of a substance like silky gum that could be tug-of-war down to the galoshes, and blinding tam-o'-shanters like patchwork tea cozies and bunny-suited busbies, and balaclavas for victims of head-shrinking tribes. From aunts who always wore wool next to the skin, there were mustached and rasping vests that made you wonder why the aunts had any skin left at all. And once I had a little crocheted horse's feed bag from an aunt, now, alas, no longer whinnying with us. And pictureless books in which small boys, though worn with quotations not to, would skate Giles's pond and did and drowned. And books that told me everything about the wasp except why. Go on to the useless presents. Bags of moist and many-colored jelly babies and a folded flag and a false nose and a tram conductor's cap and a machine that punched tickets and rang a bell. Never a catapult, once by mistake that no one could explain, a little hatchet, and a celluloid duck that made, when you pressed it, a most unduck-like sound, a kind of mooing mew that an ambitious cat might make who wished to be a cow. And a painting book in which I could make the sky, the trees, the fields, and animals any color I pleased. And still to this day, the dazzling sky blue sheep are grazing in the red field under the rainbow birds and pea green bills. Toffee, fudge, and all sorts, crunches, cracknels, glaciers, marzipan, humbugs, and butterwelsh for the Welsh, and troops of bright tin soldiers who, if they could not fight, could always run, and snakes and families and happy ladders and easy hobby games for little engineers. Oh, easy for Leonardo, even complete with instructions. Easy for Leonardo. And a whistle to make the old man, to make the dog bark, to make the old man beat on the wall with his stick to shake our painting off the wall. And a packet of cigarettes. You put one in your mouth and you stood on the corner of the street for hours, waiting in vain for an old woman to scold you for smoking a cigarette, and then with a smirk, you ate it. And then it was breakfast under the balloons. Third section or chapter, uncles and aunts. Were there uncles like in our house? There are always uncles at Christmas, the same uncles. And on Christmas morning, with dog disturbing whistle and sugar fags, I would scour the swatched town for news of the little world and find always a dead bird by the white post office or by the deserted swings, perhaps a robin, all but one of his fires out. Men and women wading or scooping back from chapel with taproom noses and wind-bust cheeks, all albinos, huddled their stiff black jarring feathers against the irreligious snow. Mistletoe hung from the gas brackets on all the front parlors. There was sherry and walnuts and bottled beer and crackers by the dessert spoons, and cats in their furabouts watched the fires, and the high heaped fires spat, all ready for the chestnuts and the mullein pokers. Some few large men, uncles almost certainly, sat in the front parlors without their collars, trying their new cigars, holding them out judiciously at arm's length, returning them to their mouths, coughing and then holding them out again as though waiting for the explosion. And some few small aunts, not wanted in the kitchen, nor anywhere else for that matter, sat on the very edges of their chairs, poised and brittle, afraid to break, like faded cups and saucers. Not many those mornings trod the piling streets. An old man, always fawn-bowlered, yellow-gloved, and at this time of year, with spats of snow, would take his constitutional to the white Bowling Green and back, as he would take it wet or fine on Christmas Day or on Doomsday. Sometimes two hale young men with big scarfs and pipes blazing walked unspeaking down to the forlorn sea to work up an appetite to blow away the fumes, who knows, to walk until the waves, until nothing other remained except the two curling smoke clouds from their inextinguishable briars. Then I would be slapdashing home, the gravy smell of the dinners of others, the bird smell, the pudding and mince, coiling up to my nostrils, when out of a snow-clogged side lane would come a boy, the spit of myself, with a pink-tipped cigarette and the violet past of a black eye, cocky as a bullfinch. I hated him on sight and sound, and would be about to put my whistle to my lips and blow him off the face of Christmas, when suddenly he, with a violet wink, put his whistle to his lips and blew so stridently, so high, so exquisitely loud, that violet faces, their cheeks bulged with goose, would press against their tinseled windows the whole length of the white, echoing street. For dinner we had turkey and blazing pudding, and after dinner the uncles loosened all buttons, put their large moist hands over their watch chains, groaned a little, and slept. Mother's aunts and sisters scuffled to and fro bearing tureens. Auntie Bessie, who had already been frightened twice by a clockwork mouse, whimpered at the sideboard and had some elderberry wine. The dog was sick. Auntie Dossie had to have 3 aspirins. But Auntie Hannah, who liked port, stood in the middle of the snowbound backyard, singing like a big-bosomed thrush. I would blow balloons up to see how big they would blow up to. And when they burst, which they all did, the uncles jumped and rumbled. Chums or friends. In the rich and heavy afternoons, the uncles breathing like dolphins and the snow descending, I would sit among festoons and Chinese lanterns and nibble dates and try to make the model man-of-war, following the instructions for little engineers, and produce instead what might be mistaken for a seagoing tram car. Or I would go out, my bright new boots squeaking into the white world onto the seaward hill to call on Jim and Dan and Jack, and to plod through the still streets, leaving huge, deep footprints on the hidden pavements. I bet people will think there have been hippos. What would you do if you saw a hippo coming down our street? I'd go like this, bang. I'd throw him over the railings and roll him down the hill. Then I'd tickle him under the ear and he'd wag his tail. What would you do if you saw 2 hippos? Iron-flanked and bellowing he-hippos, clanked and battered through the scudding snow towards us as we passed Mr. Daniels. Let's post Mr. Daniel a snowball through his letterbox. Let's write things in the snow. Let's write, Mr. Daniel looks like a spaniel, all over his lawn. Or we walked on the white shore. Can the fishes see it snowing? The silent, one-clouded heavens drifted onto the sea. Now we were snow-blind travelers, lost on the north hills, and vast dewlap dogs with flasks round their necks ambled and shambled up to us, baying Excelsior. We returned home through the poor streets, where only a few small children fumbled with bare red fingers in the wheel-rutted snow, and cat-called after us, their voices fading away as we trudged uphill into the cries of the dockbirds and the hooting of ships out in the whirling bay. And then, at tea, the recovered uncles would be jolly, and the ice cake loomed in the center of the table like a marble grave. Auntie Hannah laced her tea with rum because it was only once a year. I'm going to recite the last two sections at once. The first is ghost story, and it goes into a closing. Bring out the tall tales now that we told by the fire as the gaslight bubbled like a diver. Ghosts wooed like owls in the long night when I dared not look over my shoulder. Animals lurked in the cubbyhole under the stairs where the gas meter ticked. And I remember we went carol singing once when there wasn't a shaving of a moon to light the flying street. At the end of a long road was a drive that led to a large house. And we stumbled up the darkness of the drive that night, each one of us afraid, each one with a stone in his hand, in case, and all of us too brave to say a word. The wind through the trees made noises as of old and unpleasant, and maybe web-footed men wheezing in caves. We reached the black bulk of the house. What shall we give them? Hark the herald? No, Jack said. Good King Wenceslas, I'll count three. 1, 2, 3. And we began to sing, our voices high and seemingly distant in the snow-felted darkness round the house occupied by nobody we knew. We stood close together near the dark door. Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen. And then a small, dry voice, like the voice of someone who has not spoken for a long time, joined our singing. A small, dry, eggshell voice from the other side of the door, a small, dry voice through the keyhole. And when we stopped running, we were outside our house. The front room was lovely. Balloons floated under the hot water bottle gulping gas, and everything was good again and shone over the town. Perhaps it was a ghost, Jim said. Perhaps it was trolls, Dan said, who was always reading. Let's go in and see if there's any jelly left, Jack said, and we did that. Always on Christmas night, there was music. An uncle played the fiddle, a cousin sang Cherry Ripe, and another uncle sang Drake's drum. It was very warm in the little house. Auntie Hannah, who had got onto the parsnip wine, sang a song about bleeding hearts and death, and another in which she said her heart was like a bird's nest. And everybody laughed again, and then I went to bed. Looking through my bedroom window, out into the moonlight and the unending smoke-colored snow, I could see the light in the windows of all the other houses on our hill and hear the music rising from them up the long, steadily falling night. I turned the gas down. I got into bed. I said some words to the close and holy darkness, and then I slept. A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. So a ghost story and a fire and aunts and uncles and postmen and presents. It's all can be a little bit confusing, especially if you've only heard it for the first time, which is a good reason to listen to the story over and over again. But if you were a little bit confused by the story, you can imagine what it was like for me when I was 9 and what it might like be for almost anyone hearing the story, as I say, for the first time. The next story I'm going to tell, the last story, is a much shorter story. It also requires a bit of introduction. And it's called Every Man's Heart Laid Down. And it's by Lorenz Graham. Lorenz Graham was an African-American student at UCLA when he felt the call to go to West Africa, and he began to teach a young Christian boys' school in Liberia. And this was in the early part of the 20th century, while he was in Liberia, Liberians told him their version of a Christmas story. And when he got back to this country, he took the story that he collected and turned it into a children's book. Now, I need to explain something about this. For Liberians, of course, English was not their first language, it was their second language. And so it's not exactly perfect English grammar, as you might imagine. And when Lorenz Graham wrote the story, he wrote it in West African dialect. Now that's important for you to understand and for me, because in the time we're living in, having an old white dude like me saying a story in West African dialect is a little bit not exactly politically correct. It's not the same as, but it could be thought of as similar as to an old white dude doing a theatrical piece in blackface. Not okay. But here's the thing. Lorenz Graham wrote the story in dialect that way. So to tell the story, I have to tell it the way he wrote it. And I want to just be as clear as I can be. In telling the story, I'm not trying to make fun of West African Liberians, but to honor their telling of the story and what I view as one of the most beautiful versions of the Christmas story. It has a little bit of Noah's Ark in it, there's a little bit of Easter story in it, and their own origin story built right in. It's called Every Man's Heart Laid Down by Lorenz Graham. Long time passed before your papa lived, before him papa lived, before him pa's papa lived. Long time passed before them big tree lived, before them big tree papa lived. That time God lived. And God look on the world, what he done make, and him heart no lay down. So God walk about in the town to see the people, and he sit down in the palaver house to know the people. And him heart vex too much. And God say, never mind, the people no hear my word, the people no walk my way, never mind. I'm going to break the world and lose the people. I'm going to make the day dark and the night I'm going to make hot. I'm going to make the water that side where land belongs and the land that side where water belongs. And I'm going to make a new people and make a new country. Now this time, God's small boy, him picking, hear God word. And the picking grieve for the people. So he go for God's face, make talk for him, Pa. Pa, I come for beg you. So he say, I come for beg you. Don't break the world. What you done make. Don't lose the people. What you done care for. I beg you, make it that I go. I walk with the people. I talk with the people. And by, they savvy the way. And we can go down softly, softly, and hold God's foot. God look on him, small boy, and him heart be soft again. And God say, I, my son, when you beg me so, I know can vex. Left me now, but hear me good. If you go, you must be born like a man, and you must live like a man, and you must have hurt and have hunger. And hear me good, men'll hate you, and they'll flog you, and by, they'll kill you. And I know gonna put my hand there. And the pickins say, I agree. And by, God called Mary, or be ma, for the pickin'. Now Mary be new wife for Joseph, and Joseph ain't touched Mary himself. So first time Joseph vex. But God say, never mind, Joseph, this be God palaver. And Joseph heart lay down. And God here see one king who tried to do good for all him people. And God said to the king, aha, I send my son for be new king. And God sent Star to call the king. And in a far country, God hear wise men call him name. And in a far country, God hear wise men call him name, and God say, I send my son for be new wise men. And God sent a star to call the king, and the star come, and the wise men follow. And by the waterside, men lay down for take rest. When they hear fine music in the sky, like all the stars make song, and they fear, and all the dark make bright like day, and the waters shine like fire. Ain't no man can savvy that. And they hearts turn over. But God's angel come, and God's angel say, make glad all the people God pick and be born Bethlehem. And the people say, oh. And the wise men and the king and the country people come to Bethlehem, and the star come low and stop. But when they get to mansion house, the star no be there. And when they get to big man's house, why the star no be there. When they get to hotel, star no be there again. But the wise men say, star be by the small house where the cattle sleep. And it was so. And they find Joseph and Mary and the small pickin' fold up in country cloth. And the king bring gold for gift. And the wise men bring fine oil. And the country people, why, they bring new rice. And they look on God's small pickin'. And every man lay down. Lorenz Graham. Every man's heart lay down. That's the program. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm glad to respond to questions that you might have.
Everybody can unmute if they want to and give David a nice applause.
Are there any questions for David? Janet?
Oh, I'm just changing my view. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Speak up if you have a question, because I can't see everybody.
Or you can write questions in the chat box.
Well, if there are no questions, I hope that you all have enjoyed our special Christmas surprise. A little bit different than a luncheon together. And now, if you would like to, normally you would find these on your table at the luncheon or something similar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is lovely. What a surprise.
Oh.
I
I hope
have
we'll,
to say, I can't believe you drove all the way to Lee to deliver this for me. I was so surprised.
but when we started talking about what we could do, you know, there was the thought, was there a craft that we could all do together? You know, we delivered the supplies. The reality was no. So that was why I came up with the idea of having David, who I've met through our library here in Greenland. But we wanted to have a little share with everybody because we normally have a consumable on our table at the lunch.
Yes.
Well, normally it's a little later and we have a glass of wine also.
Yeah, I know.
Nancy, do you want to stop the recording now so that this doesn't end up posted with it, or?
Yeah, the only thing that I did have a question, and I did submit it by chat, but I must have messed it up somehow.
I didn't.
Okay, I was just wondering if David, you know, how he started doing storytelling in the first place. And, you know, how would somebody get into that if they had an interest?
Two good questions. And the first one is, as was mentioned, I'm a retired Unitarian Universalist minister. And as in many congregations, there's a story section as part of the Sunday morning service for the children in the Sunday school, in the church school. So I had an interest in trying to do stories for kids that I thought they would enjoy and would have some relationship or relevance to the story for adults. So I spent a good deal of time not only working on my sermon and figuring out the readings, but trying to figure out stories that would appeal to children and adults as well. So it started out really with my ministry. And as time went by, I just got more and more interested in storytelling. And in fact, I would argue that storytelling is a form of ministry, because at least at True Tales Live, our storytelling program, we see it as part of our mission to try to use storytelling to build bridges between people who might not otherwise know each other or not otherwise have very comparable experiences. So storytelling can be a way that people connect to each other, and they can connect on a heart-to-heart basis. So I view ministry in informal, I view storytelling as a kind of what might be called community-based ministry. It's not a formal ministry in any sense, but that's how I look at it. Now, somewhere here, and Nancy, you'll put this out as well. I've got some links. Maybe you can see this. Our storytelling website is truetaleslivenh.org. The Portsmouth Poet Laureate program is pplp.org. And if you're interested in copies of the books, I recommend that you go to River Run Bookstore, and there you can find A Child's Christmas Wales and Every Man Heart Laid Down. I don't think they have them in stock, of course. It's a small store, but it's our local independent bookstore, and they can order them for you.
Okay, David, we have a question for you. Can you explain the part of the chum chapter of the story about blowing a whistle when he sees his enemies?
Right, it was a dog whistle. The whistle to make the dog bark, to wake up the old man next door, to make him beat on the wall with his stick, to take our picture off the wall. So that's one of the presents that he gets. And then when he goes out into the white world, onto the seaward hill, as he says, He has his dog whistle with him. And then he sees this other boy who looks just like him in a way, who also has his own dog whistle. And Dylan Thomas is about to blow his whistle and blow the other boy off the face of Christmas, when suddenly he, the other boy, puts his whistle to his lips, and he blows Dylan Thomas, as he says, off the face of Christmas. So that's the idea. It's dog whistles that they use to sort of attack each other, you might say. Whistle to whistle, boy to boy, whistle to whistle. Dylan, it takes a little while to, as they say, unpack Dylan Thomas' story. That's why it's good to hear it again. And of course, it took me years for trying to figure out what he was talking about. So that's part of Chums.
Well, and I think perhaps reading the words, not just hearing them orally and being able to digest what it actually is saying, as you say, over and over. It took you years to appreciate that story.
Yes, yeah. And I think you can probably get a cassette tape of it too. A cassette tape. I bet there's a CD of it.
Still have a cassette player.
Yeah, remember when they had cassette tape recorders in automobiles? Yeah.
And now they're not even putting in CD players
Right,
in
it's all
cars.
MP3,
So, yeah.
all digital all the time.
Right. Anything else for David? Thank you so very much. It didn't have green gardens, ladies, but I hope you enjoyed our little Christmas storytelling.
It was great. Yes,
It's
thank you.
wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, Nancy, you're on.
Okay, I truly appreciated the story myself. I just think that it was a wonderful job by David. And I loved all the, I mean, I cannot wait to watch it again, because I was trying to monitor people coming in and out and looking, you know, as I have to, and trying to bring up attendance stuff and everything. So I wasn't able to focus on it. So I'm so glad that we'll be able to go on the website later on and do this. So having said that, I am going to stop the recording now, okay? Stop recording.
So Nancy,